Hey guys, Trevor with Shadow Systems, Technical Tuesday. I want to spend a few minutes and talk about finishes on firearms, specifically the ones that we use here, okay? I'm going to cover two categories of finish, the PVD finishes, which would be physical vapor deposition. That's where we basically are diffusing a metal gas on the surface of the part. And then the other would be like surface treatments, which we would think of as being nitride, QPQ, and so forth. Okay, we have used both, and I have some opinions on both. And then I'll talk about the finishes that we currently have and some other factors that play into how well they wear. Okay, so first, two categories, PVD, which is physical vapor deposition. Okay, so imagine they take the parts and they put them in a chamber and they bring the chamber up to an actually pretty modest temperature. It's around 700 degrees in most cases. And then they push in a gas, and there's essentially an arcing effect is the way it's normally done for firearms finishes. There's an electric current that's going through the parts, and there's this arcing action that occurs in that vacuum, and then this metal gas is deposited on the part. And depending upon what gas is actually in the chamber, you can get the classic TIN gold color, titanium nitride, or the bronze that we use, which is titanium carbonitride. So it's basically a really thin layer of a really awesome metal. Okay, so the one that we use, the bronze, is Ti, titanium CN carbonitride. Okay, now one thing to know about PVD finishes is they don't actually change the material underneath. Okay, so whatever the hardness is for the substrate for the part when it went in, that's still going to stay the same. What you're doing is you're putting a thin layer on the top. And by the way, it's really thin. Okay, so it doesn't make it bad. It's just very thin. For most of these, it's about 10 microns. Okay, so a micron is 3 100,000ths of an inch. All right, not 10 thousandths, not thousands, 100,000ths. So we would say that this is like really thin. It's less than 1,000th of an inch. Okay, so however, the properties of this material are awesome. That titanium carbonitride is great. It's very hard, but it's very thin. And I'll come back to some other things about how to make it work better. So we'll come back to that. All right, then the other one, and I'm going to add something over here actually. So we used to use a coating called DLC. Okay, so that's diamond-like. It's kind of a goofy name. Diamond-like carbon. Okay, so this is a black finish. And it's used a lot on gun parts. You'll see DLC mentioned a lot. One of the reasons that we moved away from DLC was that even though it holds up really well, again, you're not changing the characteristics of the steel underneath it. So your limitations, like if you drop a part or something like that, you know, the DLC may not have failed, but the substrate underneath it, unless it's like super hard, is prone to basically deforming, and then you'll kind of like almost have the finish fail because the steel underneath it failed. Okay, but DLC as a standalone finish is great, but again, it's very thin, and like all PVDs, it doesn't actually change the substrate, the material itself. Okay, then we have what generically we would call like a nitride finish. Okay, so people call it nitride. Oh, that's a lot of nitride. What it really is, it's technically a heat treatment, and it involves the use of nitrogen, okay? And then to make it black, there's usually an oxide step. All right, so this is what we use now for our black parts. All right, what is actually happening? Well, if you look at the material, the surface of the material is case hardened. So you'll start with a hardened part, you'll machine a part, you'll start with a hardened part, and then you'll run it through this process, and you end up with that same hardness at the core usually, and then a super hard outer layer. Okay, so if you actually look at that outer layer, if this is the outer layer of the steel, there'll be this really thin layer they call the white layer, okay, right underneath it. This is the white layer. And the white layer is actually where the nitrogen has diffused into the steel, and it makes this layer that is like super hard. Okay, so we're talking about hardness at the surface, a micro hardness of like Rockwell 57. Okay, that's like almost pushing diamond level hard. So The white layer is really what's wearing on the parts. That's what's rubbing together, and it makes them really, really wear resistant. It prevents deformation. It works awesome. And then beneath that, you have this diffusion layer where you kind of have this carbon. Why can't I write today, dude? Carbon that diffuses down into the steel, and you end up with a case hard depth, maybe like 5 to 10 thousandths. Okay, so significantly deeper than the PVD finishes would give you as far as what's on the outside of the part. So we like nitride because you get a more wear-resistant part. It's much less prone to scratching. They're almost impossible to scratch. If you drop it, it'll take a chunk out of the pavement, right? Whereas a DLC part, even over like a hardened 17-4 stainless steel, the DLC is just more prone to being basically damaged because it's not as hard at the surface. Okay. One thing you got to watch out for with nitride is you want to make sure that your processing for the heat treat doesn't soften up the core of the part, but that's all dependent upon the material that you're using. Okay. You'll also see this called, and there's variations of nitride. I'm calling it nitride just generically. But you'll also see QPQ, you'll see melanite, you might see somebody call it tenifer in the past, okay? They're all kind of variations of the same thing, where we have this nitrogen that is diffused into the layer of the steel, creating a white layer, and then also through that process, creating a case hardness at the surface. Okay, so that's why we like nitride. We think it's the best of all the finishes for parts. Again, super hard, super wear resistant. The oxide step turns them black. And by the way, it's interesting, because of that surface treatment and that white layer, even if the oxide gets scratched away, like or just worn away from holster wear, the part still really won't rust. Not like it would if it wasn't nitrided. The only other one to mention here is Cerakote, because we do use Cerakote, okay? So Cerakote is, everybody pretty much knows what Cerakote is. It is the best way if you're going to have a colored part. All right, there have been some attempts at using PVD for like a flat dark earth. We've sampled parts in that. We've looked at it. You have a lot of lot-to-lot variation. DLC and bronze and all these finishes. It's pretty hard to keep color consistency because little tiny variations in the gas, the makeup of the gas that they put in the chamber, can really change the color of the part. But if you're wanting a colored part, Cerakote, in our opinion, is kind of the best. It's the same every time. It doesn't quite have the wear characteristics of these other finishes. I mean, it's more prone to scratching. If you take a piece of sandpaper, you can scuff it up very easily. Less true with some of this stuff, but it does do an outstanding job for corrosion resistance. I mean, it's a paint, right? And paint does a great job at that. So it does provide great corrosion resistance. It will wear at the corners a little bit, but again, if you're wanting a colored part, there's going to be a trade-off. So we also do like Cerakote, okay? So that's the rundown. Once again, PVD, physical vapor deposition, that's our bronze, and historically the TIN we used to use, that's also DLC, which we no longer use. Nitride, that's what we like for a black part, super hard, super wear resistant, great corrosion resistance, and then Cerakote for colored parts. Last thing I want to mention here is the other thing that can have a big impact on how all of these finishes perform is what the surface condition is, how rough the part is before it goes into whatever process it might be, okay? You'll also have huge variations. So this is an older generation bronze barrel. This is a newer generation bronze barrel, okay? So you can see we've changed that pre-coating process on the new one is much shinier, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means it does better with wear. And it's kind of true on any part. Kind of the better the polish is, usually the better it wears, especially with PVDs. Why? Well, if at the microscopic level my surface is like this, let's just say I use like 220 grit aluminum oxide. Okay, that's going to be less rough than, let's say, like a 100 grit or something like that. And the reason this matters, when the parts are wearing and they're rubbing together, these peaks get knocked off, right? You can imagine that. So the amount of like material that I have exposed on a smaller or a finer grit is a lot less than the amount of material I have exposed on a bigger grit, right? And so that means that you just end up with kind of less propensity to wear, less visible wear on a more polished surface. So we've experimented with different polishes. In fact, it's interesting, you can have two completely different colors come out on some of the PVD stuff just by changing how you prep the material. All right, so there's a high level. I know that was a lot. We'll see you next Tuesday.